Welcome back to Fun Master Mike's YouTube channel, and we have a champion of the Chess.com Open, and his name is Magnus Carlsen. Now, that may not be a surprise, but exactly how he got there is a surprise. I'm going to show you today how he was put absolutely to the limit by Jan-Krzysztof Duda in the grand final. In fact, he lost the grand final, but by virtue of the fact that he was in the winner's bracket, he got basically a redo. He had to be beaten twice, and that was a good news for him because he was able to come back and win in that second game. So let's see what kind of mood Magnus was in now. He was once again playing on his tablet. He told people afterward that he didn't have a computer with him. He had his golf clubs, by the way. That's where I just got off of. So if you're wondering why the light's a little bit weird, well, I was trying to be like Magnus on the golf course. So he had his golf clubs, but he had no computer. His wife didn't want to let him borrow the MacBook, so he played on tablet. We finally got an answer to exactly why that happened. But he was in a fun mood today because look how he opened against Jan-Krzysztof Duda. Their opening match was best of four, and he played knight a3. Okay, clearly this is a man who's looking to enjoy his day because he couldn't golf. He wanted to enjoy his chess, knight a3. This game ended in a draw. This is not really the topic of our video today. Let's move on to game number 2. Now, I'm going ahead and fast forwarding, but once again, Magnus was the king of exotic openings because he played kind of a reverse Kopek system. And probably it's only about 4 of you who even know what that means, but that's okay because I don't ever want to see you play it anyway. So I'm not even going to show you what it is. Okay, it was another weird opening, but here with Jan-Krzysztof Duda being white, of course, the knight is just threatening the bishop, and Magnus loves his bishop. So instead of taking the knight, which he probably should have done because that knight is really strong, instead he brought the bishop backward, but this allowed white to play a really nice tactic. And this is actually a great example of where looking a little bit further down the road is what's going to get you to become a better calculator, because here we can all see that this pawn is somewhat pinned. If the pawn ever has to move off of the d file, we've got a lot of pieces aiming on the d file. The battering ram, as my friend Simon Williams says. So in this position, you might think that knight takes works, but after pawn takes, the problem is your queen is in front, and your queen doesn't want to give itself away for the rook. Or does she? If you look a little further, that is where you're going to find the pot of gold, okay? Let's see if you can follow with me. Then I'm going to move the pieces. Knight takes bishop. Pawn takes. Of course, that's an equal trade. Then, if you give away your queen, don't just stop after queen takes rook. Because after bishop takes and then rook takes, if you can see what's remaining on the board, white has a bishop and a rook. Black has a queen. Of course, we know the kings and pawns are still there. So, after all of that happens, the king has to move to the very unfortunate square f7, and then the rook backs up to the square I just highlighted, d7, guarded by the bishop. The rook forks the king and the queen. And once black gives away the queen for the rook, white has an extra bishop. Always push yourself to look one move further. That's one of the reasons that stronger players are stronger, not necessarily because they know more about chess, because they're willing to invest the time and the mental resources to say, okay, and then what? They don't just stop and say, I lose my queen. Okay, so here's how it went down. Knight did take bishop, pawn did take, and Jan-Krzysztof Duda did take. He's not going to miss this opportunity. Takes, takes, rook takes. And when the king moves, he did play the move rook to d7. And after takes, takes, he was up a bishop, and no surprise, he went on to win the game. So Jan-Krzysztof Duda was up 1.5 to 1/2 as they went into game 3. And then Magnus again played something crazy. On move number 1, he played pawn on e2 to e3. Okay, he said it wasn't a mouse slip. He was just looking to play something a little bit different. It transposed very quickly into some sort of like con Sicilian. But yeah, so he's got knight a3, the reverse Kopek, which again, nobody knows what that means. Pawn to e3 on move 1. I don't even remember the name of that opening. In any case, Magnus was relying on some pretty fancy openings, but it didn't serve him well because in this position, he really needed to win to even the match. He's not better at all, and he decided to try to blunt the power of this bishop by playing the move pawn to f3. But Jan-Krzysztof Duda, realizing that a draw is not a bad result at all, he would be up 2-1 going into the 4th game. He just took the pawn. Because after pawn takes and rook takes, he reasoned quite correctly that he's probably going to get a repetition at the very least, and that's not such a bad result for him in this position. Now, apparently, white might be able to defend perfectly, but that didn't happen. Jan-Krzysztof Duda actually out-tacticalized, if I can make up that word, against our boy Magnus. So after rook over to e1, pawn h5, want to add the pawns to the attack, bishop to g2. Now, the bishop gets pinned, the king steps out of the pin, and after queen to g5, it's already only move territory. What do I mean by that? Well, white already has to find only exactly one move to still be able to fight for the win. You don't want to play rook over to help defend your bishop because that takes away your king's escape square. After queen h4 check, you don't really have any moves for your king. Now, you don't technically have to guard the bishop just yet, but we do see this pawn is marching down the board. Apparently, rook e2 is the best move. Not a very intuitive move, though, to move the rook sideways. You do guard the bishop. You do maintain protection of this pawn. But honestly, even though the computer says that white's a little bit better, I don't think black has worse practical chances with this pawn still marching down the chessboard. Instead, Magnus played the very natural rook to g1. And he actually, I believe he started laughing even before his opponent made the winning move. I'm sorry, apologies. He actually played queen to f2. We already talked about rook g1. He started laughing here after queen f2 because rook takes, again, forcing yourself to look further. It looks like a move it's not possible, but if there's a double exclaim, it must be possible. After queen takes, now the rook is loose, and queen to h4 check leads to a winning queen and pawn endgame for black. Because after king g1, queen takes e1, black is already up a couple of pawns, black's about to go up a third pawn, and there you go. In the grand final, Jan-Krzysztof Duda completely crushed Magnus Carlsen 2.5 to half. They didn't even need to play a fourth game because the match was already clinched. But remember, Jan-Krzysztof Duda was coming out of the loser bracket. Magnus had not lost any matches. Now, essentially, if you want to think of it this way, they both fell into the loser bracket. We called it the grand final reset. But this, like all the other loser bracket games, was a best of two. And guess what? Magnus decided that it was winning time, and he went back to traditional openings, and he got the job done. In game one, he actually won very convincingly. In this position, he's throwing his pawn up the chessboard to h5. There are some dark square weaknesses on the board. And then Jan-Krzysztof decided that this knight was way too annoying over here on c5, because this knight over here on c5 could possibly one day maybe take the bishop and weaken this knight, or just grab a pawn or something. So Jan-Krzysztof decided to take. The problem, of course, is that now his dark squares are weak for the rest of the game. And actually, he didn't even last a couple more moves. After rook takes, you might have thought maybe there's a checkmate on g7. Not a terrible thought. But actually, after the queen moves, Magnus says, you know what? This bishop's going to be my key piece. I want to reroute my bishop to this square. So he simply took the knight, which was the main defender of f4. And after takes, he played the very simple queen to e3. Maybe the queen and bishop can one day team up on g7, but it turns out just a blunder by Jan-Krzysztof. He played pawn f6. That move is reasonably still worse. But after rook over, rook, bishop back, rook up, this rook moved over, and now the queen and the rook are on the same diagonal, and the bishop just went back to f4. So he died quickly rather than slowly, but ultimately he was much worse even at the point of the blunder. Okay, so now it's a best of one game. Magnus only needs to draw to win the grand final reset. Magnus is black, and Jan-Krzysztof, he kind of went for broke, and he very nearly got the job done. Watch this sequence of moves here. By my count, Jan-Krzysztof captures pieces on 6 of his 7 next moves. Now, if he moves the rook back to some lazy square, he just loses the vision, okay? So rook takes bishop actually does maintain an advantage. Very nice exchange sacrifice. You can see there, he gets a double X-slam this time. So that's capture number 1. On capture number 2, that gives him a very strong protected passed pawn. Now, the only move he doesn't capture on is this move, queen b3. Then he captures a pawn, that's capture number 3. Then he captures another pawn, that's 4. Another pawn, that's 5. Another pawn, that's 6. He just, look at this. He went from a very complicated position with play on both sides. Now, what does black have on the queen side? Nothing. Everything has been captured by Jan-Krzysztof Duda. He's down the exchange, but he's got multiple pawns. He's got a protected pass pawn here, and he's got every reason to believe that he's going to be able to win this game and force Armageddon for the Chess.com Open, and he was so close to making it happen, okay? Magnus realizes, I'm totally losing on the queen side. What do you do when you're losing? You create counterplay. Main theme of my Chessable course is exactly that. So pawn to h5, and the knight runs back to f2, okay? Now Magnus decides to activate his rooks, and I'm going to fast forward here after a couple more captures of some pawns to a key moment after rook to a8. Queen e2, now black's Magnus pieces are coming alive, the knight moves in, and the rook moves to c5, the knight moves to b7, and now Magnus actually missed a chance here to win the game in a very electric way. He could have left his rook on c5 totally en prise and played pawn to g3. And it turns out the attack on the h-file is so strong that you can't even take the rook because the queen can go to h7 or h6. It actually doesn't matter. Now, in just a moment, it's going to matter a lot where the queen moves. But for right now, it doesn't matter. The queen moves to h7 or h6. And white just can't get out of his own way. This reminds me a lot of those King's Indian defenses where black chucks everything at the king. And if the king tries to run away, he actually gets impeded by his own pieces and he gets checkmated on h1. Okay, there's actually not much that black can do. The computer is saying you have to give the queen away just to give the king an escape square. Imagine that. You have to give away 9 points just to give your king a little hole to breathe. Okay, so anyway, black is winning this position. That was missed by Magnus, but Pretty hard to find in a 10-minute game. So after knight b7, he decided just to keep capturing pawns. He gave the exchange back to get rid of a lot of the firepower on the queen side. And if I fast forward a couple more moves, g3, not a blunder by white because the queen invades. Now after queen over to h6, this queen's going to give check. It turns out this is the moment I was referring to. Magnus actually does need to pick the exact right queen move, because if the queen moves to h7, not h6, then after queen to d8, unfortunately, you have to block with your queen. And if you block with your queen, she's not doing damage on the knight. Then the queen can run back and take the rook without fear of checkmate on the knight. Pretty amazing stuff. And by the way, again, there's no mate this time, because even if you return to the scene of the crime, first of all, my king can run away. But secondly, I can actually go right back. I'll return to the scene of the crime, and I'll force you to trade queens. And oh, by the way, your knight is also hanging. So that's not going to work. Let's go back to this position. Well, what if Magnus had chosen h5 with the queen? Seems pretty reasonable. The problem with this move is that I'll play a very careful sequence of moves. I'll play check when your king moves. I'll check exactly on c7. And because of the threat of queen to g7, which is either going to be mate or it's going to make your king move on the run, you've got to block with your knight. But then because I picked c7, my queen can move exactly back and take your very strong pawn on g3, and white would be up 2 pawns. So amazingly, not so amazing, right? We're talking about Magnus. In this position, after queen to b6, black chose the exactly correct queen to h6. Queen h6, it's double exclam move, but it really needed an explanation for why it was double exclam. And now all Jan-Krzysztof can do is play queen d8. He can kind of threaten a repetition, but remember, he needs to win this game to tie this very short 2-game grand final reset. And so Magnus just goes back and forth and back and forth. And of course, white can't take a draw, so white decided to trade queens, but unfortunately, this is no longer winning for white. Even though white gets a 1-pawn advantage in this position, with best play, it's a draw, and it turns out Jan-Krzysztof, if you take a look at the clocks there, only had 9 seconds left. He ended up actually losing on time. Although it didn't really matter because this is a defendable position. At the very least, Magnus could trade knight for pawn in an emergency, and rook and knight versus rook, it's not as hard to defend as rook and bishop versus rook. I'm sure that Magnus would have been able to do it. So there we go. Magnus wins 50 grand, and he qualifies for the EWC finals in Saudi Arabia for the 3rd time. Okay. He qualified through this. He qualified because he's the 2025 returning champion, gets an automatic invite back, and he qualified by finishing the top 3. Of course, he won the Speed Chess Championship live in London. Jan-Krzysztof had already punched his ticket by making it to the grand final, and Denis Lazovic finished 3rd place in the event, but he'd already punched his ticket too from the Chess.com Speed Chess Championship. So the good news here is that 2 of the 3 qualifiers had already punched their ticket, which means those trying to get to Riyadh via tour points, 2 more spots just opened up because the players are already qualified, Magnus and Denis. So good news for those players who are trying to sneak their way in using the tour points method. Well, there you go. The Chess.com Open is in the books. Please like and subscribe. Without a lot of events going on in the next week or 2, I may just get back to instructional videos, which I hope you'll enjoy. In fact, let's go ahead and put one of those instructional videos on now. Why don't you continue watching and have some fun and learn something? It's not all about Magnus. I think you'll enjoy this next video that I've got queued up on the screen for you. See you next time.